Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning. Thanks for joining today's live stream, which is all about sharpening in Capture One. Maybe a subject which you think you know about, or you do know about, but I think it's always worth covering because the way we deal with sharpening in Capture One is really split up into 3 stages, which we're going to have a look at today. Welcome to those of you who are watching on YouTube and Facebook, and to those of you in our live streaming room as well. For those of you on YouTube and Facebook, if you want to ask a question, you are more than welcome to just put it into the chat on YouTube and I'll be able to see those coming through, and same goes for Facebook. For those of you in the live streaming room, please use the Q&A tab today. It is rather busy. So if you're answering questions in the chat and they tend to disappear rather quickly, and Marion, who's helping me out, won't be able to see them. So unfortunately, if you don't put your question in the Q&A, it's likely to get missed. So you'll find that on the right hand side. If you want to hide that chat to get a bit more space on Capture One, you are more than welcome to, of course, and then you'll get a bit more real estate on screen. So that is the plan for today. So the first thing we're going to deal with, as if you remember, I spoke about having 3 different ways that we can sharpen. Diffraction correction, which is what we're going to talk about first, which deals with an issue that can cause in any optical device when you use small apertures. Then sharpening within Capture One, creative sharpening, photographic sharpening, whatever you want to call it. And then dealing with additional sharpening if necessary when it comes to export. So you've got those 3 different points in the journey where you can apply sharpening and get it right, of course. That's the hope. So the first thing, let's get the mouse highlighter open, is this one over here. So this little indiscriminate box that you might have missed, diffraction correction. So what that does, we've got a bit of science coming up, so I'm going to open this. This relates to something called an airy disc. And if you don't know what an airy disc is, you can dig deep into a few additional links which Marianne can hopefully post. I will put them in the YouTube description as well if you're watching the recording. But what the airy disc is your best focus spot of light in a perfect lens with a perfectly circular aperture. So that's what, if you like, the waveform of light will look like landing on the sensor in a perfect lens with a perfect circular aperture. Now remember, apertures generally aren't perfectly circular. They're made up with a bunch of blades, so it's close to circular, but it's not perfect. So just be aware of the language there. And as the little quote says at the top, in optics, any optical instrument, so that could be, in this case, your camera, could be a microscope, telescope, whatever, has a limit of its resolution due to the physics of diffraction. Now, of course, there's other factors affecting resolution, like the quality of the optics, of course, but diffraction will definitely play a big part in it as well. And an optical instrument, again, in this case your camera, is going to be diffraction limited when it has reached this limit of resolution performance. So what does that mean? So if thinking of the airy disc above my head, on a wider aperture, let's say f4 as an example, your airy disc will fit quite nicely inside a pixel. As you close down your aperture, that airy disc will actually spread and cause confusion over neighboring pixels as well. The end result of that, of course, is a reduction in quality. So if you want to read more about the science, then we can put some links up on the YouTube recording so you can read into that a bit more. But in practical terms, how does it manifest in an image? So best way to see that is in Capture One. So we've got the identical scene shot in Chicago last month now. One is at f22, you can see on the left, and the one on the right is at f8. They were shot pretty much, I mean, we can look at the metadata. Let's have a look. Metadata wise, so this, well, it says 1:56 in the morning. It was UK time 1:56 in the morning, but not US time. It was sometime in the evening. So this was 6 seconds past. This was 6 seconds past. This was 20 seconds past. So pretty much back to back, just by changing the aperture. Solid tripod, no vibration, no wind, so the only change in environment is the aperture. Camera wise, which is also important, that this was shot on a Fuji X-H2, which is an APS-C camera, so it's a smaller sensor, it's not a full frame sensor, and it's 40 megapixels. So the density of pixels on that sensor area is also quite high. Hold that thought, because we can compare that to a different camera and talk about what factors change that. So how does diffraction manifest itself in an image? So let's zoom in first of all on our f8 shot. And something to note about this whole live stream is that it's relatively pixel peepy. Now I know you're watching on various different devices. Some of you might be on a mobile, some of you might be on a TV, some of you could be on a laptop. This is why it's important to carry out these exercises on your own imagery, because obviously we're live streaming, there's going to be a little bit of compression, so of course you might not see all the visible tiny details that I'm going to see. So it's really important that you try this out yourself as well. So image on the right is f8. Loads of detail, as you can see. Front to back sharpness. So if we look in the far distance here, this is sharp. Let's just go to 200% for your benefit. So we've got focus right at infinity, and then we've got focus down here at the front. So good depth of field. Everything front to back is sharp. Good stuff. So that's a f8. So there's no perceived benefit to me going any smaller aperture than that, because I'm not going to gain any more depth of field. The only time I might want to do that is if I want to lengthen my exposure. Now left hand side, this is our f22 shot. So let's just hide our tools for a minute and let's make these a bit bigger. So f22 on the left, f8 on the right. Pretty big difference. I would pretty much sure or think that's noticeable on whatever device you're watching. That is considerably softer, and it's not camera shake, it's not out of focus, none of those things. That's purely down to diffraction issues caused by that smaller aperture. Now, one way we can mitigate for that is to turn this on, diffraction correction. So if I turn on diffraction correction, you'll get a noticeable improvement. Now f22 on this particular lens sensor combination, we're actually getting quite a lot of diffraction correction. So I would personally, for you watching, is try to find the sweet spot of the lens, so we know, okay, what's the sweet spot of the lens that doesn't really require any diffraction correction, and how far can I go and use diffraction correction and actually get an improved result. So f22 is improved, but you know, f8 is still slightly better than f22. So even if I turn diffraction correction on f8, I actually still get an improvement, which surprised me a little bit, because typically I haven't been worrying about diffraction correction on my previous camera, or my other camera I should say, which is a Sony A7R Mark IV. Full frame camera, still pretty dense megapixel wise, 60 plus megapixels, I can't remember the exact number, but in a full frame sensor, not on an APS-C sensor, so you know, pretty dense in that respect. But diffraction correction will go some way to improving those artifacts. So even on, let's just open this shot for a second, let's turn that off. So again, this is at f8, like so. So let's clone this for a second. We make a clone variant and we bring them up side by side. We zoom into 100%. Let's pick a detail which we know is going to make a difference. We go to 200 so you can see it. So left hand side, no diffraction correction. Right hand side, let's turn diffraction correction on. And if we look at this text here, that's probably not a bad place to cast our eyes. Then we can see an improvement again in the sharpness as well. Once again, do try this at home as well, because there is going to be some compression on live streaming, so some of the finer details that I'm seeing you might miss. But I was quite surprised that I was, you know, getting an improvement at f8, because that wasn't something I was typically used to. But looking at that, sorry, fingers and thumbs, looking at this one full screen, if you like, if I turn diffraction correction off, it's kind of areas down here where there's loads of fine detail, the bricks, you know, the lines on top of the train and so on. We get that extra little nice touch of sharpness, even in this building in the background, just where all the windows are, you know, and up here and so on. We get that extra little 10% of sharpness, which, why not? Now let's compare that to different camera. So if I go to Sony as an example, so this is Sony A7R, as I said, f8, can't imagine here that I would see much of an improvement. A little bit, but not quite as dramatic as on the APS-C sensor. So again, it's about finding that sweet spot on your lens. Good comment from Tim. In my experience, I found that for the lens you used, even on 26 megapixel cameras, peak sharpness is around f5.6. Yeah, I think the old rule of 2 stops down from fully wide being the sweet spot is probably not far off, actually. But I definitely saw a difference between the Sony and the Fuji in terms of when diffraction correction gave me a great improvement, but still enabled me to use that smaller aperture. And this is not a criticism of Fuji by any stretch of the imagination. It's just simple physics of the density of that sensor. But the fact that we can correct for it is pretty fantastic. Let's see, remember, if you want to ask a question in the live streaming room, put it in the Q&A tab, because we might miss it, because I just saw Dragon had asked, is there a disadvantage to leaving diffraction correction on? Yes, there is, because you could argue, well, why don't I just turn it on? Because if we go to a shot that is pretty wide aperture, again, this is a highly detailed image, these are people, just to give you an idea of the scale that you're looking at, taken from an aerial perspective. So bags of detail in this particular shot, it's at f4. So if we turn on diffraction correction, I would pretty much guarantee that we see absolutely no perceived difference, which we don't. But it doesn't do any harm, except for your export times. So your export times will be longer with diffraction correction turned on. How much longer is hard for me to say. If you want to know for your camera sensor megapixels and the speed of your computer and whatever GPU you're running, then simply set a stopwatch, do an export, turn it on, do an export, and there's your answer. It's hard for me to give you you know, a finite number of seconds. It's not massive, but of course if you're shooting volume, you don't want to waste 500 times 5 seconds or whatever for something that's, you know, completely pointless. And no, Tundras, it's not possible to have an auto correction, because it's very much a choice. You know, yes, we could perhaps trigger it at a certain aperture or whatever, but sometimes not everybody wants finite sharpness, if that makes sense. So really it has to be a choice, and also subject dependent, like on like this particular shot. No, not that particular shot, sorry, wrong collection of images. So on this particular shot at f7.1, I still get, sorry, let's zoom in. I still get a little bit of an improvement of sharpness, but as it's a street photo, do I care so much about having a, you know, a bitingly sharp image as opposed to a cityscape or something like that? So make the choice, find the sweet spot of your lens, find the less than sweet spot but is recovered nicely by diffraction correction, and then just be aware of when, you know, you fall off the cliff and it really turns to mush. I mean, if you're having to shoot at f22 and smaller or whatever, that's then probably the time to go to neutral density filters if it's about extending exposure time. I would rather shoot at f8 with an ND filter than f22 without one. You know, personal preference as well. Few questions on lens corrections in terms of how's diffraction correction calculated. I can't actually remember the technical term for it. I've forgotten it. But it is based on a pretty smart algorithm which manages to extract that extra sharpness. We do use some data based on the lens profile as well. So if you're having to use a generic profile, if you're using a vintage lens or an unsupported lens, it doesn't mean diffraction correction won't work. Wow, you can see the distortion in that one. It doesn't mean diffraction correction won't work, but it will have less of an effect with an actually profiled lens. But you can still use it, so don't feel that you can't use it. So yeah, don't leave it on all the time because it will extend your processing times. There was a couple of questions. There was one earlier about how does sharpening compare to other applications like topaz and so on. I honestly couldn't give you a fair answer, I don't think. I would watch what we're going to do for the rest of this session and then make your own judgment. And then using your eyes, running an image through Capture One through the steps we're going to describe, running an image through something else, and then seeing what end result is better. And actually, I'd like to know your feedback, actually. That would be interesting to know. Okay, let's move on. I think that deals with diffraction correction pretty much. There's no other examples which, yeah, I need to show you. You get the idea, but you'll soon know pretty specifically when you need to turn it on based on your lens sensor combo. All right, so sharpening in Capture One. Applying sharpening. So let's grab this picture for a second and let's go to sharpening. Let's just pull that out and reset that. So part of camera support in Capture One not only involves creating a color profile, but we also create a sharpening profile, for want of a better word, and also noise reduction profile. Noise reduction we're not going to talk about extensively today, except for when sharpening can maybe exacerbate noise. So right now you can see that this image, again shot with an XH2, the default sharpening values are 160, 081. We'll talk about what these mean in a second. If I switch to a different camera like the Sony and just reset that. It's funny, I thought it was different, my mistake. That's right. Oh yeah, it is, sorry, 160, I just wasn't watching properly on the Fuji, and then 180 on the Sony as an example. So two different cameras, different sharpening levels. If we go to the Canon, you can see if I reset that, it's even less, so down to 50. So different cameras have a different default sharpening value. And that default sharpening value is based on a good compromise between adding sharpening but not being over sharp. Okay? So how do we apply additional sharpening to Capture One? So this is the default on this particular shot. I know I get a benefit by turning on diffraction correction. Looking at the image, I mean, it's very unscientific. Is that sharp? Yes, fantastic. Can I improve the sharpening further by increasing the amount slider? Yes, I can. When should I stop dragging that slider? Well, let's go to a ridiculous amount. It's going to depend on a few different factors. One, your personal preference. Some people really like to pile in the sharpening. I tend to be a little bit erring on the side of caution. The subject at hand. So does a portrait, for example, require the same level of sharpening as a highly detailed cityscape? Probably not, because we don't necessarily want to sharpen pores, features, wrinkles, all that kind of stuff. So personal preference, the content of the image, and finally, what can the image take? Because if you've got a slightly out of focus picture with camera shake, piling in sharpening isn't necessarily going to do it any good, because you don't really have a good starting point. You don't have good data to begin with. So the amount slider is exactly what it is, the amount of sharpening. The radius pretty much determines your sharpening algorithm. Are we working at a very small pixel level, or are we working at a broader pixel level? So if I zoom into 200% for your purpose again, this is a good example because we've got lots of hard edges and detail and so on. If I do a ridiculous radius and amount, you can start to see those halos forming around those high contrast areas. And that's something generally we don't want, because it just doesn't look very pleasant. It doesn't actually add detail. It just doesn't look good. So again, on this picture, it can probably stand to have a bit more aggressive sharpening, because it's a nice sharp picture at a good aperture with no camera shake, etc., etc. If you're in the business of wanting to really push the sharpening, and then you're starting to see halos around hard edges, we can pull out this guy, halo sup, which is short for halo suppression, which will go some way to reducing those halos around those areas. So if you do want to sharpen a bit more aggressively, then you can dial up the halo suppression. Threshold, which you'll probably rarely need to touch, really deals with applying sharpening to similar areas of pixel values. What that means photographically is that we don't want to apply sharpening of large areas which are of the same color. Blue sky as an example. So there's absolutely nothing to sharpen in this sky, apart from this bird probably there, but that doesn't make any point. But there's no detail, there's no clouds, there's no nothing. So applying a sharpening algorithm to that block color just means if there's any noise there, it's going to get worse. So if I doubt we will see, let's just zoom into a stupid amount. If I pull the threshold down, yeah, so now you can see that additional sharpening, because we're applying sharpening to the entire image. Now in reality, we're not going to see that. I mean, I'm at 800%. Nobody looks at pictures at 800%. So purely this is for the purpose of understanding what this slider does. So if I pull this threshold up to say whatever, now we've got a much better result because we're not applying sharpening to that block color. However, we are still applying sharpening to areas where there is obviously a change in detail and so on. So even if I pull the threshold down, you can see we're applying sharpening to these areas, which doesn't make sense because it doesn't necessarily contain details. So as we pull the threshold up, we're now limiting our sharpening to edges, which is what we want. So that's what the threshold is doing. So a combination of those sliders, you can arrive somewhere which gives you a nice sharp image, which isn't introducing any nasty artifacts. Okay. Recanto, what's the difference in diffraction correction and just doing the sharpening tool? It will actually recover more. So the kind of degradation caused on the image by diffraction is corrected nicely by ticking that box, because we know the aperture of the lens, how that particular lens behaves, and on a very sort of granular raw file level, we know some way an algorithm to run that will correct for that. So diffraction correction does what it says. It corrects for diffraction, which has a different set of mathematics to applying the sharpening. So that doesn't mean you should not use it. The exact opposite. You should be using it if it's required. I've just got to pick up on this comment. Is there a future plan of adding AI technology? There already is quite a lot of AI technology in Capture One. The culling mode, face detection on that, for example. Auto straightening is based on AI. Smart adjustments, that's also based on AI as well. So there's already quite a bit of AI technology in Capture One. And there is also AI masking on the horizon too. So which I've already had to play with to excite you a little bit. So that's also going to be great. So yes, there's AI technology in Capture One, and there's more coming as well. All right, just checking for questions over here. Helen is setting fire to her fingers, answering all the questions. I just saw one there. When to use manufacturer profile versus specific. So you might find for some manufacturers, and I can't remember all of them, Fuji for one, Sony, I think Canon RF perhaps, maybe the Nikon Z lenses have something called a manufacturer profile. So that has enough data built into the raw file which allows us to do some corrections. But if you have the choice, I would go for the Capture One profile because it's a little bit more extensive than the manufacturer profile. You can correct for sharpness fall off if you wish. No such need in this lens. You can see, which is why it's at 0 by default. So if you can, go for the Capture One one. That's the word I was looking for, David. Thank you for saving me. Deconvolution sharpening. Thank you. Diffraction correction on the layer only. No point. I mean, it's not doing anything bad to the image, so you'd be wasting your time by placing it on a layer. Let me just pick out if there's any other questions there. No, all good. All right. So applying sharpening to the whole image. So that's an image which benefits from, you know, some additional sharpening. And again, it's very camera dependent what it can stand to bear. Now this image, which was shot with a Sony A7R, this was the Fuji X-H2, default sharpening 180/0810. From an aerial perspective, through a polarizer, fast shutter speed, 1/1000th of a second, kind of high-ish ISO, 800, but nothing really that a modern camera can't handle. And if we zoom into 100%, let's find a good area of detail. Would I want to apply any more sharpening to this picture? Definitely not. I mean, this is pretty crispy in front of my eyes, that's for sure. I think applying any more, with the exception of output, but we're going to come to that. But at this stage in the sharpening process, I mean, I can see every little rock facet, tree branch, you name it. I don't see any benefit personally to applying any additional sharpening. I mean, if you twisted my arm behind my back, I might do a tiny bit more, but only if I knew I was going to print this out, because when we go to print, obviously we can stand to have a bit more sharpening. But there is very little extra I would do to this image as an example, because really it just gets unpleasant. I mean, this is perhaps not the best day to take this picture because it's midday sun, but it was definitely the best day or the best time to take that picture because we've got loads of brilliant contrast and color and so on. So, you know, this kind of image would look better sunrise, sunset, not when the sun is directly overhead, but for this reason it's very high contrast, very sharp. I wouldn't add any more sharpening to that. So really, again, it's personal preference, the subject at hand, and your end goal that you want to achieve as well. Now, everything we've done so far has been applying sharpening to the whole image, because the kind of imagery we've been looking at has had front to back elements in focus. So a cityscape from closest to furthest point, an aerial shot, an overhead aerial shot, the train, everything was relatively compressed, so everything is in focus. If we think about people, portraiture or whatever, we might be in a different situation. So if we look at our man here, obviously he is in focus, but we're starting to obviously drop off of focus relatively quickly. It's not a super wide open aperture, f5.6, but even if we go to the foreground, we're starting to lose sharpness there because we want to isolate our subject. So is there any benefit to applying a whole bunch of sharpening over the image? Probably not, because we don't need to sharpen this area. It doesn't make sense photographically to sharpen this area. So what you might prefer to do is apply sharpening locally. So what we can do is we can just kill our sharpening. We can set that to 0. We can make a new field adjustment layer by long pressing on the plus. Let's just call that, whoops, sharpening, like so. And then we can dial in the amount of sharpening we want. Now, right now, this is a filled mask. So if I press M on my keyboard, whatever I'm going to do is going to affect the whole layer. Now, I know I've just said we don't want to do that, but this is a way to visualize what's going to happen so that we can brush it in later. So if we dial in the amount of sharpening we want, and I'll go to 200% so you can see what's happening. I might go a little bit more than I would normally because we're going to selectively brush that in. So let's say that's the maximum that we can stand to bear for this particular shot. So now I can right click and say clear mask. So that will get rid of the mask, but those sharpening values which we've set for this image will remain. So mask is gone. Now we can grab our brush, right click, and paint back in the sharpening where we want it to be. So on his face, on the shirt, that's probably it. If we had our flow at 100, this will brush in that sharpening level immediately in one hit. So you'll see as soon as I start brushing, we've got that sharpening popping back into the picture. But if I want to have a bit more control, perhaps I want to have a bit less sharpening on his features and a bit more on the shirt, as an example, then we can bring our flow down. And this really cuts down the percentage of the adjustment, in this case sharpening, being applied in a brush stroke or a mouse stroke if you're a mouse user. So flow at 4 is very low, so if I brush now, that would just put a smaller amount of that sharpening into my subject here. And then if I wanted to add a bit more into the product, then I would just spend more time brushing because it's an additive process. So back and forth, we're just adding, 4%, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, and so on, as my flow is set to. Oh, I thought it was 4, but it's 5. So 5, 10, 15, 20 steps like so. So now I can brush the sharpening in where I wish. And now if we just zoom in for you guys to see, if we turn sharpening off and back on again, we've locally applied our sharpening, but everything else in the background doesn't need it. So depending on the level of pedantic adjustments you want to make, you could say, well, that's a little bit over the top. But sometimes if you definitely want to enhance a feature, especially like an environmental portrait or something like that, it's nice to be able to apply locally and not add sharpening to a background that simply doesn't need it. If we look at our grayscale mask, display grayscale mask, you can see how that sharpening has been applied. So obviously the fainter areas is less sharpening, the brighter areas is more sharpening. So having that lower flow gives you the ability to really control how much sharpening if you wish. Now, to save yourself a couple of steps, what we could do is save this as a style brush. So if this is typical values that you think you're going to end up using, then rather than going through that process of making a field layer, dialing in some sharpening, mucking around with the brush settings and so on, why not just make that as a style brush? So what we can do is go into our style brushes, save a style brush. I've selected the layer that I want to save as a style brush. So that's currently these sharpening values. Save that style brush. And I'm saving the sharpening amount because that's what I adjusted over the default for this camera. So it won't touch any of the other adjustments. And I also want to set my brush settings as well. So I'm going to say save, and then we can call this plus sharpen 300, because it's close to 300 if we're being super accurate. So now if I go to another image, let's just pick something else, another shot. Let's have one that's a bit brighter. So let's say we just want to pump a bit of sharpening, around here on our subject. We can just find it in our custom style brushes, plus sharpen 300, and then I can just do that. And that will immediately add that layer plus Sharpen 300 to those values with my brush settings as I set. And then on my background layer, I can just kill off the sharpening like so. So that's a faster way to do it. Great. Okay, how are we doing for questions? Yeah, as MI says, sharpening on a layer is a good way to maintain full control, definitely. So, you know, again, it can depend on how much control you wish to exercise. Obviously, if you've got 500 wedding pictures to shoot, you're probably not going to do local sharpening on 500 pictures. But for the 4 to 10 hero shots, maybe you're going to spend that extra time. Is there still a purple, excuse me, losing my voice. Is there still a purple fringing correction? Yes, there is. Where is it? It's under, yeah, the Refine tab here, purple fringing, like so. So yes, there is. You've got chromatic aberration correction as a checkbox, and then purple fringing as a slider. Okay, let's go back to applying sharpening. I don't just checking my notes. Last thing that I just wanted to mention, because it's bound to come up in a question. Let's just find a detailed thingy again. Let's go for this one. F11. Let's go. Oh no, not F22. F8. So often this question comes up. What about structure? Is that sharpening? Structure you'll find in the clarity tool. Clarity affects mid-tone contrast. I wouldn't say it gives a sharpening effect. It might give you a perceived sharpening effect, but clarity is improving mid-tone contrast. So if we bump up the clarity, am I on a layer? No. So if we bump up the clarity, we get an improvement in mid-tone contrast with less effect to highlights and shadows. Structure is doing the same thing, but at a micro pixel level. So it does then improve things with, actually it's not the best example. Let's go for this. So we've got high frequency stuff. If I bump up my structure, I'll go to a stupid amount, you can see what it's doing. But obviously you need to exercise caution because that looks pretty ugly now. So anything with, you know, high frequency grids, animal fur, feathers, architectural details will benefit from a bit of structure. But just be careful, if you go too far, it's going to start to look ugly. And also it's not going to magically place details there that didn't exist in the first place. So you can see the front of this train is ever so slightly blurry because it's moving. See our train driver here is a little bit blurry. So by adding structure, it suddenly doesn't magically get rid of the motion blur. In some ways, it would actually make it look worse. So it won't magically pull detail that doesn't exist, but on an area of high frequency, like let's go into Trump Tower for a second. So if we add in, you know, 16 points of structure, all this detail here in the brickwork, high frequency stuff suddenly gets that extra little bump. But just use it cautiously. I wouldn't push this as hard as I would sharpening, as an example. Okay, let's see. Matthias says, David, can you use a picture which is not perfectly sharp as an example? I mean, we can, but you won't get as much benefit. I mean, we just saw, like with the front of the train, you can't magically pull sharpening out of something that isn't sharp as such. Of course, I personally don't have any out of focus pictures, of course. Most of the stuff in here would be relatively, whoops. Let's find, this is an old picture, different camera once more. It's actually pretty sharp. That's an iPhone picture, I think. We did discover, we had a little play earlier with diffraction correction. I didn't find an iPhone RAW example that really lent itself to a benefit of diffraction correction. So I'd say I don't know how many situations there are really where you actually need that. So, I mean, this image, it's not perfectly sharp, but still fairly good. Trying to see if I've got anything else blurry. That's a little bit off. It's not perfect. But again, you're blessed with these two things in your head, which are great for evaluation. So you will be able to very quickly see if you have any benefit from moving those sliders, pretty much. Sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out answer to your question, but it really is the truth. Like, use your eyes. Does dragging the slider give me any benefit? Yes or no? Let's see. I think. Oh, that's an obscure question. Does diffraction affect striped textiles? I wouldn't think so. But try it. Again, a lot of this stuff is experimentation, but I personally don't think it would. There's very little negative effects to diffraction correction if it's required to use on an image. I mean, I've never seen a situation personally where I've turned it on and thought, oh, actually, I've got a worse result. It's always an improvement. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Mark says, can I show how purple fringing works? I could, but I'd have to probably spend 10 minutes trying to find an image that has purple fringing. But if you see purple fringing on a high contrast area, it would manifest itself on, somewhere around this kind of thing where we've got bright light hitting a hard surface like a window frame or something like that. Then purple fringing will just get rid of that as you dial it up. Alrighty, let's move on. What's next? Export sharpening. So you've fixed your diffraction, you have creatively sharpened your image to an acceptable amount, whether that's over the entire image or selectively, and now you're ready to export. So this is where the third step of the process comes in. So what shall we export? Shall we export this picture maybe? So what's this adjustment layer doing? Oh, stuff down the front, that's fine. So let's export this shot. There's loads of detail in it, so we'll be able to see, differences in Photoshop and so on. So I'm ready to export, so I'm going to hit export like so. And this pops us up in the exporter. Now what the exporter is doing is constantly showing you the effect of any selected export recipe. So if I zoom into 100% and I go to TIFF, which is a full-size TIFF, then the picture's going to get bigger because it's going to show me 1:1 in the exporter because we're at 100% scale. 1 pixel on the camera sensor is 1 pixel on the monitor. Okay, so if I choose a recipe which is, say, scaling the picture, so this is scaling the long edge to 2560, it's going to shrink down. So the exporter shows you exactly how your picture is going to look once you've hit the export button. Now if you don't use the exporter, let's cancel out of that, and you have set up your export tab, so you remain within Capture One's main interface, you will find, if I zoom in to 100%, as I'm flicking through these recipes, I'm not seeing any change in the viewer. That will only happen if you turn on recipe proofing. So this will proof for you in the viewer what the recipe is doing. So if I turn that on, you can see proofing, and the size of my image is now changed. So if I go to a full-size TIFF, it's going to get bigger. If I go to the 2560 pixels for web use, it's going to get smaller. So let's turn that off, and then I'll use the export dialog. So what should we do first? Let's go to 100%. Make sure you've got this box ticked on, show all options, because if you don't have this checked on, then you won't find the adjustments tool, which allows you to put in output sharpening. So why would you want to do that? Because when you scale an image, and this also includes shrinking it down, that has a negative impact on the sharpness, which you should compensate for. So on this particular picture, if we scale it down to 2560 pixels across, we can see that's a scale of 33%. So we're tossing away 66% of the image. Now, if we don't compensate for that for sharpness, then we actually get a softer result at the other end. So what we should be doing is saying, yep, give me some output sharpening for screen because this is going on my web page as a nice full screen background or something like that. So as soon as we turn this on, you get an additional amount, radius and threshold sliders like so. And this will, or sorry, the viewer will constantly show you what's happening. So if I put the amount up to a stupid level, you can see that viewer changes, you know, in real time how the sharpening looks. So by default is 80. Let's just bump this up a little bit to 120. I think this image can stand it. There's lots of nice detail. I wouldn't want it to look soft on my web page as an example. Let's export this one out and have a look in Photoshop. So let's say export. Let's see. Oh, the notification is on the other window. So that's this picture. And we're going to drop that into Photoshop. That's that one, and we're going to go back into Capture One. We're going to hit export once more, and we're going to say no, or let's say disable all. So we've got no output sharpening, so that would not add any additional sharpening for the scaling. Print would come back to, or we can say disable all. So this will kill all sharpening. It's going to turn off the sharpening tool in Capture One. It's going to disable our diffraction sharpening. So we've got nothing essentially. And let's export that one out as well. And then we'll look at them in Photoshop. So let's call this one NOSH, lovely word, for no sharpening. And let's open that up in Photoshop 2. And we're going to tile these up vertically, and let's just zoom in to these two and have a little look around. That's 200%. So on the left hand side we've got our nicely sharpened picture with our output sharpening as well, compensating for that change in scaling. Go away. Got it. If we look at, say, far distance is always telling. So if we look at the windows, much softer. If we look down here on the train tracks, again we can see a decrease in sharpness, and so on. Now you should of course try on your own pictures once more. Hopefully it's visible just by looking on the live stream broadcast, but as I said, it's kind of a pixel peeping exercise, this one. But there's a very visible difference, you know, looking on my screen for sure. Like if you look at the detail here on the brickwork, you know, it's way mushier there compared to here. So you should be compensating for scaling in Capture One. I'd say that it was more common knowledge that upscaling a picture, say trying to interpolate and add pixels, would reduce sharpness, but it works the other way. So when you downscale, you're also affecting sharpness as well. So this is a good way to compensate for that. Paul says, can you suggest an absolute JPEG size? No, you can't. And I would actually argue you don't want to do that because you lose control over more important factors. Because if you're saying limit my JPEGs to 2.5 meg or 1 meg or whatever, then the quality slider is going to be dynamic. And then you're going to end up with a set of pictures which have varying JPEG compression, which isn't good. So what you should be doing is setting your scaling in terms of pixels, whether that's dimensions or a long edge or a short edge or a width or a height, because then you get consistency. You shouldn't really be looking to have the exact same megabytes per JPEG, because the way JPEG compression works, it's based on image content as well. So you will get wildly varying quality slider outputs, which is a bit of a no-no. So look to limit height, width, dimensions, way better. Good question from Werner. He said, would I do output sharpening if you kept the scale to 100? No, I wouldn't. So if we go back into Capture One, let's say we had our TIFF output like so, I would probably not bother doing any output sharpening unless I was going to print, but not for screen, no. But it's very rare you would end up outputting a TIFF file at 100% because it would be huge to fit on, you know, a mobile device or a screen or something like that. For print, so let's turn this one off. Let's go to, let's say we want to make a 30 by 20 print. So in my export recipe, I've got the dimensions set to 30 by 20. And then what we want to do is go to output sharpening for print. And you'll see if I flick between these different options, the dialog changes a bit. So now we don't have a radius, we have a distance scale. And this is viewing distance. So if this is my picture, is it going to be up on a wall over here somewhere, or am I going to be holding it at arm's length, like at a book or something like that? So if we go to 100%, like so, let's say our viewing distance is whatever, a book, what's that, 40 centimeters, I suppose, 40 to 50. You see the sharpening is going to be less. If we're viewing at a distance, let's say 1.5 meters or so, if it's hung on a wall, then we can afford to sharpen it a little bit more. We can be more aggressive. So this is a scaling of 116, so we're actually adding a few more pixels in. So important to sharpen for output as well. So let's go ahead and let's just delete our JPEGs for a second. Let's get rid of those, otherwise I'll be confused with what's what. So this is going to be our 30 by 20 print with sharpening. So that's our, let's open that up in Photoshop. Now let's go back to Capture One. We are going to disable all of our sharpening and export once more. Yep, like so. Let's put Nosh at the end of that and open that up in Photoshop 2. Going to tile these vertically and let's zoom in and have a look. So now if we go up to 100%, this is our no sharpened one. Let's go up to 100%. This will probably look dramatically sharpener, dramatically more sharp, which you can see quite clearly. I can anticipate the question because we had it this morning. What should, if I manage to open Capture One, let's add in our print. What should this number be, the amount? It's going to vary, really. I found that, what is the default? Let's just reset the tool for a second. So if I add that, I found that I preferred it, again, personal preference, around 60, and I set the distance correctly. And that gave me actually a pretty good amount of sharpening, which looked good on print, I have to say. So I actually, for once in my life, printed this image and hung it on a wall at home. And I followed that process to the letter, pretty much. So bring that one back, bear with. So I pretty much followed that to the letter. I took the amount down a tiny bit and then I put in the correct distance. It's hung at the top of the stairs, you kind of walk past it. So I figured it's probably around a meter, something like that. And it came out great. But you might want to experiment that depending on, you know, the paper you're printing on, whoever's doing your printing, if you're doing it at home, to, you know, balance between what you feel is an acceptable amount of sharpening. Again, there is, you know, some personal preference going on there as well. But I found that algorithm actually to work very, very nicely. All right, last few questions and we will see what happens. Let's just check. Marianne's been doing a fantastic job in the background answering a bunch of questions. Brett was saying, have I tried combining sharpening in Capture One with the external sharpener like Topaz Sharpen AI? Any tips? Starting the external sharpener or apply import sharpening in Capture One? I'm not experienced enough with Topaz to give you a finite answer. But what I would say is, I mean, I think there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around sharpening that you have to do all these clever steps in Photoshop and this, that, the other, and so on. I'm not necessarily signed up for that. So I would run an image through the steps that we've spoken about today. Run an image through your, suggestion, like you said, Topaz sharpening. And can you see a viable, visible difference? And I'd be really interested to hear the results, actually, because I'd quite like to know, what's the difference? Are you suddenly pulling out data that you didn't see before? I mean, remember in Capture One, you're working on the raw data, so that gives you a bit of a good head start as well. I would certainly think there's probably better applications out there for upscaling and so on. By, if you want to do a large amount, something like 116% is neither here nor there, really. That's an easy task for Capture One. But if you wanted to do massive upscaling, then yes, there's probably applications out there which are specifically written to do that, which Capture One isn't, as an example. But whether external sharpeners are better or not, I simply don't know. But I would do as I've said, run through what we've done today, run through on your plugin, external sharpener, different app or whatever, and then see what the difference is. Let's see, we answered that one, we did that. Kay was asking, what does the sharpness slider do in the lens correction tool? This one here, it's what's the word, truncated. Oh, that's silly. It's sharpness fall off. So if you have a lens which is getting softer towards the edges, it can go some way to improve that sharpness. But what you'll see is that by default, it's generally probably at 0. So on this particular lens, there isn't really any fall off. So we're not dialing it in for the sake of dialing it in. But if you imagine like a radial mask of where it starts to get softer, you can compensate for that. So that's what that does. Is the proofing and export viewer identical in function? Yes, it is. So if I'm proofing in the viewer, it's no different to doing it in the export viewer, but you have to manually turn it on and off when you're working in the viewer. Let's see. So I've got half a question from Carsten. Output sharpening using a recipe will ruin sharpening one did apply before and not improve further. No, it doesn't. It's additional to that. So remember, the sharpening I'm applying within Capture One is regardless of the export. Because let's say this image, let's say I'm going to put it on Instagram, which I did, and let's say I'm going to print it out to a large amount. Those two exports require different treatments of sharpening, but the start point is valid. So what it avoids you doing is, well, let's say this is going to go to Instagram, so I would sharpen it to what I felt, and then I knew, okay, I'm going to print this, so what I'm going to have to do is clone it, and then probably bump up the sharpening and do some other bits to get it print ready. So it avoids you having to do that step. So Carsten, it does not ruin the sharpening that you applied in Capture One. So 3 steps, your diffraction correction number 1, applying a decent level of sharpening in Capture One, which will then go on to serve very, very well different export options, whether that's reducing it for web use or making a nice large print or something like that. It won't ruin it, it builds off it. It's compensating for export, okay? Hope that makes sense. So it does not ruin it at all. Where'd you get your prints made? Very infrequently, Scott. I think the last print I had done was at the print space, and they did a great job. So, but that's the level of my printing experience. I'm terrible at printing. I don't have a printer at home. I prefer to let the exports do it, but Print Space did a very nice job. Yeah, so Dustin, can I output a catch-all sharpening for an outputted file to be used in a magazine print and then for social media? Same file, different sizes. Yeah, exactly, because that's the whole point of the export recipes, because each recipe is going to have a different output function. So you'll see on my TIFF 30 by 20 print recipe, we're output sharpening for print. On my 2560 for web use, we had output sharpening for screen. Instagram optimized also has output sharpening for screen, and I've dialed that up a bit because I felt it could take it. So yes, your start point kind of echoes what Carsten said in Capture One. You're then firing out different exports, being sharpened additionally by varying different amounts depending on their output use. So yeah, that's the whole enormous benefit of export recipes, and there's no reason why you can't run those recipes at the same time as well. Jared says, for output sharpening, the difference between inputting either a specific inches or centimeters compared to percentage of diagonal. Yeah, I think that goes back to yeah, viewing distance. It's either, quite often we talk about, you know, the diagonal of a print is roughly what you would view it at, perhaps. So, but I prefer to think of it as an actual distance. The algorithm isn't doing anything different. It's calculating that distance based on the percentage of that diagonal. But I always prefer to use it in centimeters or inches. So think about what the typical viewing distance would be. Yeah. Can you add external editors such as Topaz II to the edit with menu? Yeah, you can do. You just need to, I say that, let me just double check. If you go into plugins, then you can say plus, and then you can add your application like so. So into preferences or settings, hit the plugins button, and then hit that, and then add your application. And then that will pop up in the open with menu. Sylvian says, is there a way to sharpen for print directly in the printing tool? There is a sharpen algorithm, but I would be honest and say the export one is more sophisticated, I would say. So if you really want to nail your sharpening for print, I would actually export it and then print, if that makes sense. Rick, eternal question. When looking at a monitor, how do you know how much sharpening to add for a print? You don't really, if I'm honest. I say it's a little bit trial and error. So I found, well, as I explained earlier, I found what the happy medium was. But again, there's a lot of personal preference in there. So I think once you know, okay, I've got a sharp image with this camera, I know what I can push it to. So it's just going to come down to that, I think. Do different print services apply different sharpening? Possibly. I'd always have a word with your print supplier. What do you do to my print? I personally, so the print in question, which I made, you know, a few weeks back, this one, yeah, this print here, I supplied it exactly to the size I wanted it printed. So I didn't give them, you know, the biggest TIFF file I could generate. I knew on the piece of paper I wanted it to be XY big. And I exported an image exactly to those dimensions. So I knew when they printed it, they weren't going to scale it up or down, which would have a negative impact on the sharpness. So there would be no benefit to me sending them, I've given you this massive 16-bit TIFF with all the data, because all they're going to do is scale it down, and then I don't have the control of the output sharpening. So my one piece of advice would be to always deliver the right sized export, and then you can have a conversation about which profile to deliver it in and all that kind of stuff. But I would deliver the image that you want to print. All right, I think that is probably it. What I want to show you is what's happening next week. August, is that next week? Yes, August 31st is about black and white. That QR code, if you point your mobile device at it, that will take you to the web page to sign up for that as well. I can put a link in the comments if I'm quick. We'll put it in the YouTube description as well. That will come up tomorrow. So let me just grab this link, because I'm pretty sure Marianne is busy answering 3 billion questions. Let's do that. Type your message here, and add. Okay, so in the chat I've just put a link up. I can also edit the sticky as well. Oh yeah, if you had clicked on that sticky, that would actually tell you what lens diffraction is as well, but I'm just going to edit that sticky to put in the link like so. So hopefully that will go in there as well. Yeah, so that will take you to next week. So I hope you found that useful today. There's probably a lot more to sharpening than you may have thought. At least I hope there is in Capture One. It's pretty sophisticated, and of course it's about efficiency as well, of course, that you're sharpening a given image to a certain point in Capture One, and then you are deciding what additional sharpening that needs depending on the output requirements. And that's way more efficient than creating 3 or 4 clones in Capture One and sharpening them differently. So I hope that come across for sure. Anyway, I hope to see you next week when we talk about black and white editing, and there's more stuff coming up in September as well. So enjoy, and hope to see you all next week, and have a good weekend when it comes. Take care and see you soon.